Welcome everybody to Fearless Wisdom. And today I have Alexander J. O'Neill, who his Buddhist name is Shaku Shingan, and he's an assistant professor at Musashino University in Japan, and also a Shin Buddhist who has published on various Buddhist topics. And today we are discussing his translation of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, which is an important text in the Shin Buddhist tradition. Um, well, and thank you for joining us uh, today,
Thank you.
Alex. Um, so your translation of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, um, it offers us a opportunity to engage with the significant but lesser known, perhaps lesser known text from the Japanese Pure Land tradition. So can you start maybe telling us a little bit about the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, what kind of work it is, and why you chose to translate it again? Because there's other translations of it, right? And what makes it important?
Sure. Thanks for your question, and thank you for doing this podcast, and also for your channel. Uh, Thanks for what you've been doing over the years, and your philosophy videos have been, I found them to be very helpful. So, with regard to the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, um, yeah, it's as you say, it's a text which is very important in the Jōdo Shinshū tradition, but it seems to originate from the Seizan tradition of Jōdo Shu. But it seems like it has become, I'm not sure how relatively important it is in Seizan Jōdo Shu versus Jōdo Shinshu, but it became so important in Jōdo Shinshu that it's included within the Jōdo Shinshu seiten or canon. So it's considered a very helpful text in Jōdo Shinshu for understanding what is meant by faith, what is the nature of the Buddha, and how the Buddha relates to sentient beings. And so, what the Anjin Ketsujō Shō is, and here's the translation that I published earlier this year. It's translated as the essence of the determination of the settled mind, and we can talk a bit about what that title means. But essentially, what it is it's essentially it's a very doctrinal text. It seems like it was not intended for a popular audience. It was probably intended for a scholastic monastic audience, an internal audience within the tradition in which it originated. And it also, at the same time, it seems to have some kind of pedagogical function because addresses it addresses some of the fundamental questions of Pure Land thought as they developed in Japan. And it also has a lot of admonitions to the readers on the fact that they should rely on the other power of Amida Buddha rather than on their self power. So it does have a pedagogical function, but it's so doctrinally heavy that it seems like it was not intended for a wide audience. Like for example, Shinran Shonen's Wasan poems, Japanese poems would have been. And then, in regard to what makes it important, the we can get into a lot of the specifics of the doctrines discussed within the text, but it has a few interesting ideas like what is the nature of faith, or Anjin, the settled mind, as it calls it, and how the Buddha relates to sentient beings in regard to time, and how how sentient beings' minds relate to the Buddha and to the Dharma. And it also has this idea of timeless awakening, that the Buddha attained awakening, the Bodhisattva Dharmakara attained awakening as the Buddha Amitabha 10 kalpas in the distant past, but that at the moment that he attained awakening in a single thought moment, we also, our awakening was also assured at the same time. And so there's an interesting connection between the awakening of the Buddha and the awakening of sentient beings, that it encourages sentient beings to awaken to. And then in regard to why I decided to translate it, if we have a look at the translations that were out there, one of the things that I found with them is that they are scattered in journal articles and they're not accessible to a general readership. So on the one hand, I wanted to have a single, both a PDF file that people can access and search and use digitally, and also a single volume that people can refer to. So that's the main reason. But the other one is to have more explanation of some of the key terms and also annotation. So one of the nice things about the Jōdo Shinshū Seiten version of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō is that it has a lot of annotation. And so most of the annotation which can be translated, some of it doesn't make sense to translate because it's referring to specific Japanese terms or Chinese terms. But most of the annotation that could be translated, I did translate. And also the divisions of the text have been decided traditionally. And those divisions also are represented in this translation, whereas in the previous translations, they weren't represented. And then another reason is when we have a look at the traditions of Buddhism that are available today, in the West, in English, such as Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, there are a lot of both practice-oriented texts and texts that go into doctrine, whereas for Pure Land Buddhism, there's not a lot which explains the theoretical underpinnings of how Pure Land Buddhism works, and that's something that I think the Anjin Ketsujō Shō does very well. And then in regards to traditions, on the one hand, we have the Seizan branch of Jōdo Shu, or Pure Land Buddhism, mainstream Pure Land Buddhism in Japan. And there's not a lot of people who are in Jōdo Shu who speak English often mention that there seems to be not a lot of texts from their tradition available in English. And so on the one hand, I wanted to make something from Jōdo Shu more accessible to a general audience beyond the writings of Master Hongan. And then on the other hand, it's a text which is very important to the Jōdo Shinshū tradition, because it was referred to many times by Rennyo Shonin, who was one of the head priests of the Honganji tradition of Jōdo Shinshū. And so it's a text which bridges these two approaches to Pure Land Buddhism. And so it is a kind of nice, it's a nice text to work on and to present. And so those are some of the reasons why I decided to go through it. And I'm always looking for something which people might be interested in to translate and to make accessible. And this was something which I thought would be a nice addition to what is already available.
Yeah, thank you. And so you already mentioned Rennyo Shonin, and so I wanted to talk about some of the people that are like important around this text. The author, we don't know for sure who the author was, but it seems like there's maybe the growings of a consensus, or at least a larger number of scholars think that it was this person called Shōkū, who was one of the students of Honen, correct?
Yeah, that's right. The founder
Yeah,
of the Seizan branch.
the Seizan and Jōdo, yeah. And then so he may have been the author. So can we say maybe a little bit more about this plausible author, Shōkū, um and then also Rennyo, who's like perhaps I guess the person that really popularizes this text in the Shin Buddhist tradition. Maybe say a little bit about um a little bit about him and how he popularized the text. So I think we can leave that towards the end mainly, but there's these two people who are influential when we talk about this text. So maybe we can discuss Shoku at least.
Okay, sure. So Shoku, yeah, he, as you say, he was one of the disciples of Honen Shonen, and sorry, yeah, Honen Shonen, and so what if we have a look at his if we have a look at his writings, um, we see someone who was influenced by Honen in the same way that perhaps Shinran was influenced by Honen. And he, the reason why the branch of Jōdo Shu that he founded is called Seizan is because it was in the western mountains of Kyoto. So Sei is west and Zan is San, Yama mountain. And this became one of the two largest branches of Jōdo Shu. Another now the authorship is actually not very clear, and there are a lot of theories as to who authored the text. Now, originally within Jōdo Shinshū, it was originally often attributed to Kakunyo, who was one of the descendants of Shinran Shonin, and also to Kakunyo's son Zonkaku, and also it has been attributed to one of Shinran's students, Shinbutsu. It has also been attributed to Itten Shonin, who was another who was the founder of the Jishu school of Pure Land Buddhism. But for many reasons, it seems like it originated within the Seizan branch because a lot of the terminology that is used, such as Kiho Itai, which we can talk about later. This is terminology which is used within the Seizan branch of Jōdo Shu. And another person who might have been the author is someone called Anichibo, who seems to have originated or first used the concept of Kiho Itai, unless Shōkū wrote the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, in which case it might come from him. But those are the origins, and the study which actually seemed to make it seem definitive that it was Shōkū was a study in the 19th century by Jōdo Shinshū Hongan Jiha, which identified or determined that it was probably Shōkū who wrote it. And so the rumors that it was something which originated within Jōdo Shinshū were quashed. Sorry, the people who did that study were in the Otaniha branch of Jōdo Shinshū. And then your other question was with regard to Rennyo. So Rennyo is sometimes called the restorer of Jōdo Shinshū. And the reason why is, so within Jōdo Shinshū early on, it wasn't really thought of, Jōdo Shinshū wasn't really thought of as a separate sect from anything that Honen Shonin founded. It was thought that Honen Shonin was the Kaizan, the founder of the sect, but that Shinran Shonin just clarified the essence of what Honen Shonin taught. But over time, distinct interpretations based on Shinran Shonin's writings came to be emphasized, and that became those became the teachings of Shinran's descendants, who were the curators of Shinran's mausoleum and also the Honganji temple. And eventually, Rennyo Shonin became the head priest of the Honganji temple. And at that time, the Honganji was burned down by Tendai monks, and Rennyo Shonin fled to the north of Japan. And over time, he worked to reestablish Honganji within the Kansai region, which is around Kyoto and modern-day Osaka, and eventually founded or reestablished the Honganji in a place called Yamashina, and then eventually in Ishiyama, which is in Osaka, and it's the site of the modern-day Osaka Castle. And the the reason he's considered the reestablisher or the restorer of Jōdo Shinshū is because it was on tenterhooks. It seemed like Jōdo Shinshū could have gone out of existence if it wasn't for Rennyo Shonen, because it was being hunted by other sects for various reasons. One of them was the fear that Jōdo Shinshū was promoting something called licensed evil. And so if everyone is saved without having to do wholesome deeds, then surely you can just do whatever you like and you can still be saved. And this seemed to threaten the established understanding. But also Jōdo Shinshū seemed to threaten the dominance of the major forms of Buddhism at the time in Japan, such as Tendaishu, and it became very popular because of its ease of practice with the peasantry, but also just with a broad array of people who found it to be accessible, because you don't have to do initiations and you don't have to do shugyo or difficult practice in order to progress. And so it became very popular. And so these are some of the reasons Jōdo Shinshū was persecuted. But yeah, Rennyo Shonen is considered the reestablisher, and one of the reasons, or the restorer, and one of the reasons why he was so successful was because he wrote letters in what are called the Gobunsho, and these were very popular letters, which made the teachings very simple in Japanese, not in Chinese, because most of the monks at the time were writing in Chinese. Because they were very scholastic, and it was kind of like the Buddhist lingua franca. And then another thing that he would do is do Dharma talks and discussions with the general public, which was not very common as well. So he did a lot to repopularize Jōdo Shinshū, and the Anjin Ketsujō Shō is something which he refers to a few times. And apparently he was said to have worn threadbare his copy of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō. So he read it so many times, and he encouraged people to read it 100 times, because he said it contains the essence of the tradition, even though it's quite difficult to read. So I don't know if the average person would be able to understand it, but he kind of simplified a lot of its doctrines in his letters. And you can see that if you go through his letters.
Okay, thank you. So the title of the text, I feel like we should begin with that, because it seems like it contains a lot of the essence of the essence. So the title is translated Anjin Ketsujō Shō, and which you translate as essence of the determination of the settled mind. So maybe if we could sort of go through each of those key terms, like what is the settled mind, Anjin? Is it the same as Shinjin in Shin Buddhism? And what is determination, Ketsujō?
So the first part, essence, is I'll just mention is the show at the end, and that the translation of show is really in this context is actually technically it's kind of like commentary, but the character actually kind of literally means a summary, and so yeah, essence is kind of a literary way of treating that. Then okay, so in regard to the settled mind, or Anjin, this is made up of two characters. One of them is the character for peace, An, and the other one is Kokoro, or Shin, the mind. And so this is a mind which is free from doubt. It's at ease. And so this is a synonym for Shinjin. And Shinjin is a term for faith, just in general in the Buddhist texts. In Jōdo Shinshū, it's used synonymously with Anjin. If you look at modern English Jōdo Shinshū translations, like by the collected works of Shinran, they often leave it untranslated, and that has kind of made Shinjin into, like a capitalized word, a very important word, but it's actually just the word for faith that we find in almost all of the Chinese Buddhist translations. And so people might not have thought so much about that. And so I think using Anjin probably signifies a more specifically Jōdo / Jōdo Shinshū understanding of what Shinjin means. And so then the other thing is Ketsujō, determination. And this means the characters are literally to essentially decisive settlement, decisive confirmation. And this refers to the determination or decisive confirmation of one's status as essentially irrevocably fixed on the path to Buddhahood. And one enters what is called the rank of the definitely settled or rightly assured, or Shōjoju. And in Sanskrit, this is referred to as Avaivartika or Abhinivartika, the non-retrogressing. And so these are bodhisattvas who are not retrogressing from Buddhahood. And so the idea in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō and also in Jōdo Shinshū is that if one receives Shinjin or Anjin, or one has this state of mind, one experiences this state of mind or has a state of mind, the practitioner, the devotee, is not going to backslide. There's nothing that they can do to avoid being born in the Pure Land. They will definitely be born there. And because they're born in the Pure Land, which for those listeners who may not know, refers to a land where you could say on the relative level, it can be thought of as like a finishing school or a university where bodhisattvas go and they train on the path and they attain Buddhahood in that land. And then on the ultimate level, at least in Jōdo Shinshū, it's understood that upon birth one attains Buddhahood or nirvana. But in either case, the point is that once you're born in the Pure Land, your Buddhahood is assured, your awakening is assured. And so the determination of the settled mind is referring to the settled mind, which makes one determined, makes one irrevocably irreversible from the path to birth in the Pure Land and Buddhahood. Yeah.
Yeah, and what comes to mind for me is perhaps for people who are watching who may not have or this may not come up, that is a pretty radical position in the grand scheme of Buddhism, because to say that when you have like faith, any kind of faith, I guess, that you've reached the stage of non-retrogression. Usually, in most of the explanations of the path, faith is like at the beginning, and they have to do all this other stuff, and then you finally get to the stage of non-retrogression. But in this Pure Land text, it's saying that through this kind of faith that the text is going to teach, you attain the stage of non-retrogression, which is like supposed to be a very lofty and very difficult stage to get to. So that's pretty radical, right? Am I right in saying that?
Oh yeah, and this is something which we kind of find in some other traditions, like in the Huayan tradition, and we actually find something like this within a lot of Mahayana sutras as well. That when one arouses faith, the rest of the path is kind of assured, even though one still might have to walk the path and gain accumulations. And so one of the thinkers who I saw a similarity to was the Huayan master Li Tongshuan. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but he has this idea that when you realize the shared ontological reality between yourself as a sentient being and the Buddha as the ultimate principle. This is how we define faith, and this is actually the same definition that the Anjin Ketsujō Shō has, the Kiho Itai. And when one has this faith, this is the initial manifestation of awakening within a practitioner, and that's because that faith mind is actually the mind of the Buddha. It's Buddha nature. It's kind of like a slice of ultimate reality within your mind that you always have access to, but it's not always present. So it's a bit like under the ground. In most of the world, there's groundwater. You just have to dig down to find it. And there are springs where the water comes up. It's just not everywhere that the water comes up. For people with faith, they have that spring. The water comes up from the ground. But for everyone else, it's also there. And so for Lee, realizing faith is essentially a kind of realization of your own Buddha nature, and it allows for a kind of a presaging or a preview of your own awakening. And the Korean master Jinul also taught that the faith which serves as the cause for Buddhahood is none other than the Buddha's mind itself. And so this is something which was in the air in the mainland as well, in both Korea and China. And Li Tongxuan's teachings were known in Japan at the time. And the Japanese Keigon master Myoe relies on Li Tongxuan. So it's possible that there was some kind of connection there, but I think you can also kind of tease out these ideas from within the sutras themselves.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is like the Lotus Sutra, which is, like it says like, okay, you will become Buddha if you like accept the scripture and like have faith in the scripture and all of that. Like you will definitely become a Buddha if that's the case for you. So that it's at least another case of that. So then the first fascicle of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, it begins with a discussion of the original vow or the primal vow or the past vow of the Buddha Amitabha. And the text specifically quotes Shandao in his Liturgy for Birth, in which he restates the vow, which is the 18th vow. And that piece of text that gets quoted states, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings throughout the 10 directions who, having called my name, even to 10 recitations, should not be born, may I not attain perfect awakening. And I guess I want to start talking about this vow now because this seems to be like the most important vow in Pure Land Buddhism, especially in Shin and in this text. Why is this the most important vow? Why was this picked out by the tradition out of the 48 vows in the larger sutra, the larger Pure Land Sutra? Yeah.
So that's the core of the matter, because for the Anjin Ketsujō Shō and for Jōdo Shu and Jōdo Shinshū, actually the meaning of Anjin, the meaning of faith, is the primal vow or the 18th vow. And so the 18th vow is called the hongan, or primal vow, original vow, past vow, root vow, you could say. And so when one listens to the Dharma and one understands the Dharma as it relates to oneself as a limited sentient being, ki, that the term ki refers to a sentient being, and ho is the Dharma. And so when one realizes the significance of the vow for oneself as an ordinary being, and one realizes the inseparability of that vow from one's own nature, then one has Shinjin or Anjin. One realizes it, but it doesn't arise by one's own power. Now, in regard to your questions, the statement, the way that Chen Dao words the statement, it's a poetic restatement, because he's writing a praise it's from a praise in the Ojo Raisan, and so he rewords it in some ways. And well, now before I explain specifically his rewording, I'll just explain a little bit about why the 18th vow is chosen out of the 48 vows. So it's understood, the Anjin Ketsujō Shō understands that the significance of all the 48 vows is the 18th vow. And so all of the other 47 vows serve as a kind of primer to help beings understand and guide beings to the 18th vow. And so the 18th vow is considered the root of them all. And so all of the others spring out of this. And so the reason why is because the 18th vow assures all sentient beings Buddhahood by simply recognizing by simply bringing to mind their salvation, that their salvation is assured. And that's what the vow states. So simply by acknowledging this and trusting in it, tanomu, that means relying on it and accepting that one doesn't have to do anything else to attain liberation, to attain birth in the Pure Land. One will attain birth in the Pure Land. And so all of the other vows have to do with different kinds of things which you could say adorn the primal vow, which adorn the 18th vow. So some of them talk about the form that beings would take in the Pure Land. They will all be equal in appearance. They will all have a pure appearance. There won't be any discrimination, any grounds of discrimination between beings there. Another important aspect is that the world, it establishes that the world will be beautiful. And so it has relative truth teachings. These are kind of dualistic ways of describing a Pure Land to make it attractive to sentient beings who can't conceptualize non-duality. We can't think of non-duality, so we have to have something to cling to, so to say. So it's all geared towards ordinary beings who find it difficult to realize non-duality in this body. And then there are some other vows, the 19th and 20th vow, which also provide means of birth in the Pure Land. So the 19th vow talks about engaging in wholesome acts and then dedicating the merit to birth in the Pure Land and wanting to go to the Pure Land. And so this requires a kind of faith, but it's not sole faith alone upon the Buddha's power. It relies upon the sentient being's own power. And then the 20th vow is where people recite the Nembutsu, or recite the name of the Buddha, or recall the Buddha, and then dedicate the merit of that to, or do other practices related to Amitabha Buddha, and dedicate the merit of that to birth in the Pure Land. And so this also relies upon the sentient being's power. It's only the 18th vow relies solely upon the Buddha's power. That's why the 18th vow was considered the primal vow, because it is entirely 100% a pure cause, which brings about a pure result. And so within the Pure Land tradition, especially with teachers like Chen Dao, it was emphasized that if you have an impure cause, an impure cause can only give rise to an impure result. And so if sentient beings rely on their own power to try and attain birth in the Pure Land through the 19th and 20th vows, for example, he would say maybe 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 might succeed in attaining birth, because people backslide. They might not attain. They might not have the right focus. They might not have the right kind of practices or what have you. But with the 18th vow, because it relies entirely on the Buddha's power, one essentially relies on the Buddha's merits. The Buddha dedicates his merits to us as sentient beings. And so we rely only on the Buddha's power And so that's why the 18th vow is the universal vow. It's the ocean-like vow, which can encompass all sentient beings. Whereas the 19th vow, 20th vow are for people who have diligence. They're for people who have discipline. They're for people of greater greater wisdom and greater ability than the average person, the average sentient being. In regard to how Shandao words his restatement in the Ojo Raisan, he rewords it in a poetic way, and it's they're 4-line verses, and the first few are like Nyaga Jobutsu Jippo Shujo ga Shoga Myogo Geshi Jusho Nyafu Shoja Fushu Shogaku, and this is excluding certain aspects of the vow which we find in the sutra. So in English it would read, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings throughout the 10 directions who, having called my name, even to 10 recitations, 10 voicings, should not be born in my land, not be reborn in my Pure Land, may I not attain perfect awakening. And so people who are listening who are familiar with Pure Land Buddhism will be familiar with the structure of the vows and know that they're kind of stated in the negative, that if this vow is not fulfilled, the Buddha will not attain awakening. And since he did attain awakening, the vow is said to be true. This excludes the exclusion clause. If you read the vow, the 18th vow in the sutras, it says, excluded of those who commit the 5 grave offenses and slanderers of the Dharma. And so the reason why Shandao didn't include this is because he has a commentary on the Contemplation Sutra, the Amitabha Buddha Sutra, which identifies that if we have a look at the means by which beings are born in with different capacities, different grades of beings who can be born, even those who commit the 5 grave offenses ultimately are able to be born. And so Shandao reinterpreted the exclusion clause to be understood as a relative teaching within the definitive teaching of the primal vow. And that relative teaching serves to encourage beings not to do unwholesome deeds. And then another thing which some people find about Shandao's restatement is that he specifically singles out calling the name or reciting the name rather than visualizing. And so if we have a look at Shandao's commentary on the Contemplation Sutra, we'll see that he identifies that the contemplations and the visualizations within that sutra, they are not the teaching that the Buddha gives unsolicited. Those are teachings that the Buddha gave specifically in response to questions by Queen Vaidehi on how she can see the Pure Land. And so, in fact, the visualizations are not presented as a means of birth. And people often misunderstand this, but the visualizations are presented as a means to see the Pure Land, and it can help one gain faith. It can support one's practice, but they are actually not the means by which one is born in the Pure Land. Rather, one looks at the section after the contemplations, where we have the 9 grades, where it explains how different kinds of beings attain birth in the Pure Land. And there it has this recite my name. It has Nen, which is to be mindful of the Buddha, to recall the Buddha. And Shandao identifies that at the end of the sutra, the Buddha specifically entrusts the name of Amida, the name of Amitayus, to Ananda. And in doing this, he suggests that the Buddha left the most important teaching for last, and signifies that the recollection of the Buddha is specifically, it can be many things, but the definitive understanding of recollection of the Buddha is the recitation of the name or recollection of the name. And the Anjin Ketsujō Shō does say that even if one doesn't vocally recite it, you can still recall the Buddha. But the reason why it's not other practices whereby one recollects or is mindful of the Buddha is because recitation is the easiest one. If we rely upon our samsaric, dualistic, and delusional minds to contemplate the Buddha, we'll make mistakes. We might have intrusive thoughts while visualizing. And if you've done meditation, I'm sure you've experienced this, right? Things come up and you're like, that's not supposed to be there. But with recitation, that can't happen. Um, and so with recitation, people who have difficulty calming their minds, focusing their minds, are able to practice as well. So it's the most accessible form of practice. And Shandao begins his commentary, and this commentary is quoted a lot in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō. He begins his commentary with he has a few prefatory things, but he begins by looking at who is the teaching intended for. And he said, there are some people who say, oh, this teaching is intended for elite practitioners, those who practice diligently, can be born in the 9 grades. Well, actually, he says, in fact, that's not the case. Even the highest grade of practitioner is still an ordinary being, because elite practitioners don't have to rely on birth in the Pure Land. They can cultivate by themselves, and they can attain these. They can attain the qualities that one wants to be born in the Pure Land by their own power, by their own cultivation. And so the Pure Land teaching is specifically for people who are incapable of attaining the qualities of the requisites of awakening, the accumulations of merit and wisdom. They're incapable of doing that by themselves. And so they have to rely on the Buddhist power. They have to rely on being born in the Pure Land and then training in the Pure Land and attaining the attainments that one can there. So I think that that thoroughly covers the Shandao's interpretation of the 18th vow, and Shandao's interpretation of the 18th vow is how Honen understands it, and that's how the Jōdo Shu and Jōdo Shinshū sects understand the primal vow. So really, Shandao is like he's not really the founder of a sect, right? But we kind of consider him the de facto, de facto, I guess. Chinese, the most important Chinese patriarch of Pure Land Buddhism.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Charles Jones is like the one who says like he's the real like founder of like Chinese Pure Land, if you will. Uh, um, so yeah, thank you for that overview of Shandao. I mean, obviously the Anjin Ketsujō Shō also takes that whole like background of Shandao's thought as for granted, basically, right? So like when it cites this passage, it's sort of calling to mind all of this that you just discussed. So it's kind of important to have that as a background. So I wanna then discuss uh something. So there's in the introduction you write that and I quote, Dharmakara Bodhisattva would not have become Amida Buddha unless all sentient beings were assured of birth in his land. Since Amida has in fact now attained Buddhahood, the birth of all beings has been settled. And the Anjin Ketsujō Shō itself says, at the single thought moment when sentient beings throughout the 10 directions fulfilled their birth, the Buddha also attained perfect awakening. Thus, the Buddha's attainment of perfect awakening, along with our own birth, are accomplished simultaneously. So, so this seems to be saying that due to the boundless power of Amida's vows, Amida's attainment of Buddhahood and our birth in the Pure Land take place in a single timeless moment. And since this transcends, time, I guess, space-time, our future birth in the Pure Land and our Buddhahood have ultimately already been accomplished, in a manner of speaking. And when we recite the Nembutsu, then it seems like we're just expressing this non-dual truth, or sort of waking up or acknowledging the liberation that's already been granted to us by the Buddha's power. That seems to be the sort of radical position that the text is stating. And then I guess the big question that comes when we hear that is, if that's the case, then why is there even samsara? Like, why are there still beings that have not awakened? Or maybe we can say, maybe they are like awakened in some way, like, original enlightenment or something, but they still haven't had the acquired enlightenment, if you will, to put it in those terms. Um, or, and some people acquire this knowledge sooner than others. And, so why? What's missing from the side of sentient beings? Is it the Anjin, right? The Shinjin, the faith? Um, is that what's missing? Can you fill that in?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, the idea here in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō is that yeah, the Buddha attained awakening, uh, and in a single thought moment, he he accomplished the liberation of all sentient beings because that's how the vow is structured. But this is essentially a non-dual or ultimate reality level understanding, and on our side, we are working on the level of relative truth. We can't grasp suchness, we can't grasp emptiness as ordinary beings fully. And this is something the Nirvana Sutra says as well, that a sentient being, when they're trying to grasp Buddha nature, it's like a person seeing, birds flying in the corner of their eye. They might think, they were cranes, or they were stalks, but they don't know for sure. They just saw the kind of shadow. And so even the bodhisattva at the 10th level, they still just see that kind of shadow in the corner of their eye. Only when one fully realizes Buddhahood do they have that 100% penetration of the non-dual understanding. And so another aspect here is is time, that for sentient beings on the relative level, we perceive time, but on the ultimate level, there's no relativity. Although it encompasses our relative understanding, as you will know from studying Tendai, um, but uh, but it transcends all time. So it's a oneness, an ichinyo. It's one thing, and so it's something we which we can't realize through our own practices. And so the missing link is that Shinjin or Anjin. Um, so so how does this work? Essentially, the idea is that, as I mentioned earlier, Anjin is the mind of the Buddha, which we can access as sentient beings. It's kind of like a portal to the ultimate reality. Now we don't. Now, in doing this, we can get kind of like a taste of the bubbling to the surface of this essence, which is this ultimate nature, this suchness, which underlies all reality. But we can't fully realize it until we lose our samsaric, karmically conditioned bodies and are born in the Pure Land. But Anjin is the key. And so the question with regard to why is it that we're not already awakened is one that comes up in it's kind of addressed already by the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, but also by Rennyo Shonen, who identified something which he called the Jikko Iju, which means the heterodox view regarding the 10 kalpas. And so there were people at the time of Rennyo who were saying, well, we've already attained awakening 10 kalpas ago because the Buddha attained awakening, so we don't have to do anything. And what Rennyo said was actually that this is to misunderstand the teaching of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō and the teaching of the primal vow. You still have to entrust. You still have to have tanomu. You still have to hear the primal vow and have an understanding. And it's at that point that you open your eyes and see what was there before you the whole time. It doesn't mean that it was absent before, but you do have to open yourself to it as an ordinary sentient being. When one has one thought moment of Anjin or Shinjin, then essentially one's mind has a turning, and one is oriented towards the Pure Land rather than towards samsaric rebirth. And so when one has that one thought moment within dualistic relative time as an ordinary sentient being, that one thought moment that you have of Anjin or Shinjin is the exact same thought moment of that ultimate timeless realization of Dharmakara. And so that's why, his realization, which we can express dualistically as happening 10 kalpas in the past, is actually happening, whenever one realizes Anjin or one realizes Shinjin. So his realization transcends time, but we describe it using skillful means so people can understand it using the story of Dharmakara, this relative dualistic story of Dharmakara, as something that happened 10 kalpas in the past. So if we pursue this to its logical conclusion, even 10 kalpas in the past, however long ago that might be, even 10 kalpas in the past, there was also a Dharmakara 10 kalpas in the past before that who will have had to have attained full awakening at that time. And so this is kind of, you could think of this as kind of an eternally recurrent truth of reality. That's always the case. It's because of our relativity. It's because of our calculative thinking that we have to have this understanding that it's something which happened before, which is outside of us. But when we realize that one thought moment, that becomes one with the thought moment that is beyond time. And so that's kind of how it connects. But if we don't realize that one, if we don't realize Anjin, we don't realize Shinjin, that connection is never made. It's there, it's available for us to make that connection, but the analogy that it uses later is like fire and wood, right? Let's say there's a fire, maybe on a torch, and there's a piece of wood. They can both exist at the same, the fire, the flame, and the wood can both exist at the same time without the wood being on fire. The fire's over here, the wood's over here, but they're both there at the same time. And the wood has the potential to be on fire. And then, but once you connect it, then the fire connects to the wood, and they're inseparable. The wood is not the same as the fire. The sentient being is not the same as the mind of awakening. So we continue to have hakarai, we continue to have calculative thinking until we pass away. And so you can think about this as being like the flame gradually, the flame gradually eats up, it gradually burns and turns to charcoal, turns to smoke and dust, the wood. And then when the wood's completely spent, it's like the end of our lives, then all that's left is the flame. And the flame, of course, kind of like in the agamas, there's this question the Buddha asks: when the flame is extinguished, does it go anywhere? It doesn't go anywhere. We can't say that it is extinguished in any direction. It just is extinguished, and so that's nirvana. But we have to make that connection in order for us to be liberated. So we have to have entrusting. We have to have Anjin.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. And it's kind of hard to get away from the feeling that this sounds a bit like Zen's like Kensho experience kind of thing, right? Though it's still different in the sense that it's more of a faith-based experience than the more sort of wisdom-based experience with Zen. But the idea that it's this sort of moment that connects you to the Buddha mind and it's sort of timeless, and uh it kind of reminds you of some of the Zen language as well. And I know that's a whole can of worms, and I don't want to go down that route too much, but yeah, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, there is a lot of similarity with Dogen, and actually, I I although because you're talking about Kensho, then it's maybe it's a bit, there's a bit more to say with regard to the Rinzai approach, but I did have a note in the book about Dogen, but who may have been a next door neighbor of Shinran apparently.
Right.
So yeah, that's the idea. I mean, as far as I understand, uh, uh, Kensho, that's the same principle that one realizes in one moment. One has a glimpse of Buddha nature, which is Now, yeah, it probably depends on how we define that. But so the characteristic of one of the characteristics of Shinjin or Anjin is that it's diamond-like, and it's you can't lose it, and it doesn't require anything on the part of the practitioner. So after one receives Shinjin or Anjin, you may have positive influences throughout one's life, but you don't necessarily come away from that as a more like a wise master or something, like you would expect, someone who's realized Kensho to be able to answer, any question with a wise comeback or something. I guess that's the popular understanding, which I'm probably wrong there. Uh, but um, but yeah, the one remains an ordinary being until one's birth in the Pure Land. But the principle of having that connection between your mind and the Buddhist mind, rather realizing the connection between your mind and the Buddhist mind, which was there before, having that realization, that understanding, is critical in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō's understanding of how that works. So that is a similarity, but I can't really speak too much about the Zen understanding.
Yeah, yeah. Me neither. I don't have extensive training in Zen. So I guess the next thing I want to ask is uh, the 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 Anjin Ketsujō Shō and Shin Buddhism in general as well is generally seen as the path of other power, like relying solely on other power, and rejecting self power. And the Anjin Ketsujō Shō uses, I believe, the metaphor of the sun's light and how you can't see by unless you rely on the sun's light. And so we can't awaken without relying on the Buddha's power. Um, and I think it also has this metaphor of like when the sun rises, the darkness is immediately dispelled. But I still get the feeling that like, okay, there's this thing that's required of us, right? Like faith. We need to somehow have faith. Um, and some people don't have that. Um, and if there wouldn't, if, it seems to me when I read this, it's like, okay, there is something we still need to do. Like if there would be nothing, then everyone would already be saved and would go into Sukhavati after they die, and they wouldn't have to like worry about like reading Pure Land texts or anything like that. So like the way I think about it is like yeah, there's like the light, the sun is out, but I need to like open my window to let the light come in, right? Like that's the way I think of it. Like I still got to do something to get that light. If I'm not just getting light just automatically. Um, um, so I guess I still want to come back to that. Like, how do we understand this idea that like there's still something we got to do, or some kind of practice, or some kind of intentional act, even if it's just like turning our attention to the Buddha. Um, and yet, this is not self-power. Like this, it's okay that we can say like there's something that we need to do, but it's still not considered self-power. Can we say that? Like, can we make a distinction like between like self-powered effort, which and like an act, an intentional act by like a sentient being that relies on other power or like sort of hooks onto other power, but um it's not considered self-power. Does it make any sense what I'm trying to get at here?
So you mean, maybe to restate this, do you mean let's say, trying to understand to gain the understanding that's required to receive a Shinjin or Anjin? You're asking, is that listening to the Dharma, is that understanding itself a kind of self power that can enable other power?
No, maybe not that it's
No,
self-power,
okay.
but yeah, like because at least from the Japanese Pure Land tradition, we don't want to say that we're relying on self-power. That's more of like a Chinese Pure Land tradition in which like it's okay if we have self-power and other power, they work together. But like in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, my understanding is like we try to say like we're getting rid of self-power. But there's still stuff that we do, right? Like even if we don't consider it self-power, um,
Hmm.
or
So
I mean like if we want to
yeah.
get Shinjin, and like we don't have Shinjin. Like let's like someone doesn't have Shinjin, but they would like to. Um, okay, what do they do? You know, do they just
So
wait?
yeah, well, so there's so how do we define self-power and other power? Uh,
Yeah,
essentially, uh, the power here, be it self or other, is the the enabling mechanism that brings about realization. It brings about Buddhahood, brings about the attainments required for Buddhahood. So self-power acts that work to allow one to attain Buddhahood that are things like trying to practice let's say, trying to practice the dhyanas, trying to engage in good deeds, uh, but calculating that if I do A, B, and C, I will get the results X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. Um, so it's the criticism of self-power is that from this understanding, it's kind of like a Buddha nature approach, is that it's always calculative. Whenever we're approaching things in this self-power approach, we're always calculating. And we're saying, if I do A, I get B. But because we have now, Anjin Ketsujō Shō doesn't make this explicit, but it kind of implies this hongaku or original awakening understanding that we already have Buddha nature. Whenever we engage in calculation, we're missing the mark. We're missing the fact that we already have access to the thing that allows us to attain awakening, and that's our Buddha nature. That's this thing that when we see it, when we activate our connection to it, the rest of the path follows spontaneously. And how does one come to that point? And the way that it's understood in the Jōdo Shinshū tradition and essentially by the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, and this is how Rennyo uses it as well, is to say that it's through an understanding that comes about through listening to the Dharma. And the definition of Dharma here and the object of understanding is actually the primal vow. But it doesn't mean that you listen to the wording of the primal vow, endlessly, like listening to a piece of music. It's rather any Dharma teaching that points you towards the fact that you're already embraced just as you are. And so it can take on, listening to the Dharma can take on various forms. But the listening itself and the object, the listening itself and the words that we use to understand the Dharma, they are like the finger pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself. They're not the power. They're not the mechanism which brings about birth. The thing that brings about birth is Shinjin or Anjin. And so yeah, maybe I'll see if I'll circle back to you. So does that respond to you, or is there something that I'm missing there? Something that you
no,
need me to explain a bit further?
no. I guess that makes sense. I guess what we need to do is to like listen to the Dharma. So like read the scriptures or if audiobook, I guess. Um,
Well, let me just put it this way as well. And you used the analogy, which I might have included I might have included somewhere in this of the window with the light. I mean, the Anjin Ketsujō Shō uses the idea of eyes and light. But anyway, with the analogy of the window and the light, the sunlight is there outside the window, but you have to open the curtains for the light to come in the room. And let's say the room is your mind, right?
yeah.
So you have to open the curtains to let the light come in, but the light's already there. Opening the curtains is not actually making light. The sun is making the light, right? And so the Shinjin, the mind of awakening, which is fully realized 100% after birth in the Pure Land, that is coming in after we listen to the Dharma, after we entrust. That's to say, we open up the curtains, and what opening the curtains represents is letting go of self-power and entrusting. So it's literally being open-minded, letting the Buddha's light come in, and the Buddha's light is compassion. The Buddha's light is his wisdom, and it's always available for us. But you do have to have a teacher. You do have to have someone or something. It could be a written indication that points you towards doing that. So we can't do it automatically. We can't just be born as a human and then immediately attain Shinjin. You have to have understanding. So that's why listening to the Dharma is considered essential in Jōdo Shinshū and the Anjin Ketsujō Shō. But Anjin Ketsujō Shō clarifies that the object of that listening, of that understanding, is the primal vow. However one words that and understands that, it's pointing towards that connection that we have to the mind of the Buddha, and the ultimate non-duality, not the relative non-duality, but the ultimate non-duality between the sentient being and the Buddha. Kiho, sentient being, and Dharma, Itai, is one.
Right. So I wanted to circle back on the idea of timelessness and the timeless moment, and so the idea is, of course, the Buddha is beyond time, but then of course we have the story about Dharmakara Bodhisattva, who was Amitabha Buddha when he was a bodhisattva in the deep past, and he practiced the path and so on, and then made the vows and then attained Buddhahood. So that seems like a story that is instantiated in time. He made a vow that he practiced for a very long time, eons, and then he attained Buddhahood at a certain time. So how do you understand that? Is Dharmakara Bodhisattva, like, was there really ever Dharmakara Bodhisattva like in time, or is that something that happens? Yeah, I don't know. I have a hard time understanding, like, if the Buddha is this timeless being, right? And it's a timeless moment. How do we understand that story, which seems to be a story that relies on time and spending time to practice the path and so on?
Yeah. So again, this is using the relative as a whole ben or skillful means to indicate the ultimate. So to reiterate the relative story, there's a monk, Dharmakara, who was a king who renounced his throne, and then he renounced his throne after he encounters the Buddha Lokeshvara Raja, and decides that he's going to attain Buddhahood and make it possible for all beings to attain Buddhahood. And so he engages in 5 kalpas of contemplation, surveying all of the Buddha lands and all the directions and all the beings in those lands, and identifies all of their qualities, and figures out precisely what is the perfect way to construct this land and construct my vows to make it possible for beings to attain birth there. And so then he makes the 48 vows, within which is the 18th vow, and then he cultivates and eventually attains Buddhahood as Amitabha. And so this is a kind of narrative in cosmic time, in relative terms, that we can understand as ordinary sentient beings. If we could immediately grasp the ultimate truth that a Buddha realizes, then the Buddha would only have taught the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, or he would maybe just teach the Perfection of Wisdom in one word or one letter, right? But because we can't do that, even if we're practicing, even people who are practicing Perfection of Wisdom, they still engage in temporal practice. They engage in rituals, worshiping the sutra, and so forth, as it says in the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. And so the story of Dharmakara is a provisional, skillful means to help us grasp the infinite mind of the Buddha, which has infinite compassion and infinite wisdom. And so it's a pedagogical tool to help us help us give rise to awe, trust, uh, and reverence. And so there are lots of things within the story and the description of the Pure Land which make us as ordinary sentient beings aspire to be born there and help us to connect to that ultimate truth. Now, did it really happen historically or not, I guess, is maybe part of your question. But we can ask ourselves, what parts of our life let's say if we go back 10 years, if we recall back 10 years ago, what parts of our life 10 years ago can we recall with 100% accuracy if questioned by the police? And as you might know, the memory, it's constructed largely, it's constructed by the brain filling in gaps, and it creates a narrative. And so the past is always some kind of narrative. And so this is kind of going in the face of, you could say, a positivist understanding of history, that there's something which definitely happened or didn't happen. So it's kind of a mystical understanding. It's a mystical understanding of reality, but it's actually kind of like a subjective first-person understanding of how the world works. We can't know what happened in the past. Even in our own lives, we can only know the present. And so the perception of the past is a delusion. The perception of the whole world is a delusion. The relativity between things, the separation between you and I in space and time, that's also an illusion. It's all maya. So we can use skillful means and provisional understandings of the world in order to point to and have something to refer to when trying to understand the ultimate. And so that's what the story of Dharmakara, of Shakyamuni Buddha, of anyone is. And so then on the ultimate side, because it goes beyond the perception of relative time, there's simultaneity and there's spontaneity. Everything is naturally so, jinen honi. And this is something which, when we realize Shinjin or Anjin, takes it it manifests in our daily lives. This spontaneous working of the primal vow, it can manifest primarily in our utterance of the Nembutsu, that it comes about spontaneously by the power of the vow. It's the recognition within our mind of the inseparability between the sentient being and the Dharma. So Namo, as the Anjin Ketsujō Shō says, Namo is a sentient being who takes refuge and has faith, and Amida Butsu is the Dharma, the infinite Dharma, the absolute Dharma of Amida Buddha. So it's the sentient being and the Buddha becoming one. And this is also signified by the Gassho gesture, the sentient being on the left and the Buddha on the right coming together. That's how we understand it in Jōdo Shinshū and Pure Land Buddhism. And this is very similar to understandings that we find in you brought up earlier, the Lotus Sutra, that the Buddha that appears in our world, he appears to be born and pass away, but this is actually a manifestation, a play. And the Buddha has been awakened since beginningless time. But as a skillful means to enlighten sentient beings, he creates this narrative that we can view. But people actually view different narratives. They view different Buddhas depending upon their conditions. So depending upon their states of mind and their inclinations. This is also something that the secrets of the Tathagata Sutra, the Tathagata Guhya Sutra, also makes clear in the chapter on the inconceivable secret of the Tathagata's body, speech, and mind. And then, of course, in the Huayan, from the Huayan perspective, Li Tongchuan, he also points out that past and future don't depart from the present thought moment on the ultimate level. And so I think that probably answers your question, right?
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something in the book that Rennyo interprets the Nembutsu with Namo Amida Butsu, which is like the most important practice in Pure Land Buddhism. the name of Amida Buddha, expression of reverence. And he interprets that as meaning that beings are non-dual with the Buddha. So the Namo, I guess, represents beings, and Amida Butsu, the Buddha. And like even though that phrase, like Namo Amida Butsu, like I go for refuge to the Buddha, like that has a dualistic structure, like in the language, right? Like there's someone who's going to is going for refuge in the Buddha, but in there's also a unity at the same time. So there's like a unity between dualism and non-dualism, you know? The non-dualism allows for a certain kind of dualism as the skillful means, uh, is how I understand it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, uh, that's also that's how the Anjin Ketsujō Shō understands the Namo Amida Butsu. That Namo is the mind of refuge, and Rennyo specifically identifies the key of the sentient being, the Namo, as actually the sentient being's faith. So the thing that actually has the unity with the Buddha is the Anjin, which we have access to all the time, but we don't necessarily, we're not open to it, right? So it's always there. And so the thing that allows us to become one with the Buddha on the ultimate level is this faith, which is actually, it is the mind of the Buddha. And so they're one, they're not separate. And this is also why, because it's the faith, it's the entrusting. That's also why we can be ordinary sentient beings with this body and these defilements, afflictions in our minds, our bonno, and at the same time have unity with the Buddha, because it's not our samsaric being, which is a karmically conditioned phenomena, temporary, illusory phenomena. It's the non-temporary faith, the diamond-like mind of Shinshin or Anjin, the Namo, which is one with the Buddha. And so this is likened to there's an analogy that the Anjin Ketsujō Shō uses, which you mentioned earlier, the sun's disk. So it says, it's like someone trying to see something in the dark at night, relying solely on the feeble power of one's own eyes. This is absolutely impossible. However, when we receive the light of the sun into our eyes, our relative eyes, then we can see objects that are illumined by that light. We can have the light can allow us to see things. That ability to see is entirely due to the power of the sun. However, even if there's sunlight, if you don't have eyes to see, you can't see. So you have to have that capacity. Or if you have your eyes closed, you still can't see. So you have to have that capacity. You have to open the eyes. And so that's the same with us sentient beings. We have to open you could say, open the channels of faith, as Rennyo puts it, clear the channels of faith, and allow the light to come in. And so that's just like how we have the faculty of vision and the vision itself. That is the function of both the eyes and the light. But the power is entirely the light. That's what conveys the image, right? And so that's other power. If you have the eyes but there's no light, you can't see anything. So that's self power alone. If you have self power without the other power, there's no vision of the truth. And so the light is Amida Butsu. That's the Dharma body, and the primal vow. And the eyes are the sentient being who has refuge, who has faith. And so the Anjin Ketsujō Shō there concludes that receiving the merit of the primal vow occurs within the 6 characters Na, Mo, A, Mi, Da, Bu. The Tsu is a glottal stop, so Bu. Where by simply entrusting oneself and calling the name, saying the Nembutsu, all practices, virtues, and merits, as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, are completely realized in just one recitation. And thus there's no need to seek other merits or good roots. It's all the merits of the Buddha, the treasure ocean of virtue is in the name. It's all there.
Yeah, and I guess that takes us to this idea that you find in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, which is at least you translate it as the inseparability of name and substance, which means that the Nembutsu, that phrase, Namo Amida Butsu, contains or is the Buddha itself, right? Or contains all the vows and practices, all the virtues of Buddhahood. And I guess it's a bit inconceivable how that's possible, how like just a phrase or a sound can be the Buddha itself. And I guess so what really is the Nembutsu then? If it really is the Buddha, how can that sound when I say that phrase, Namo Amida Butsu, like that is the Buddha? That seems pretty hard to understand.
Oh yeah, and that's why the understanding has to come about by other power. uh, but so on this term, the inseparability of name and substance, or myotai funi, myo is the name of Amida Buddha, and tai is the substance thereof, which is which is uh, which is the object to which the name refers. That's Buddhahood itself, or the Dharma body, Amida Buddha. And so this term actually myotai comes from esoteric Buddhism, Mikyo, where the name or a mantra, the word of the mantra, is equal to the deity. So when you recite the mantra of, let's say, um, let's say Tara,
Fudo Myo.
the mantra is Fudo Myo. It is the substance. It is his body, and so this is something which we have in common with esoteric Buddhism in Pure Land Buddhism. And another another place where we find this is actually all throughout Mahayana Buddhism. So this isn't exclusive to esoteric Buddhism, but for example, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, it says that the true body of the Buddha is the sutra. And so that's why that's why Mahayana Sutras, this is true for a lot of Mahayana Sutras, that's why they have this these passages, these self-referential passages, which implore the practitioner to take up, bear, read, recite, copy, spread, teach to others, even as much as a single, one 4-line verse. The merit of that, outstrips, any other kind of practice. And so this is essentially central to Mahayana thought. It's just that in Pure Land Buddhism, like a lot of forms of East Asian Buddhism, there's what's called a panjiao, where there's an idea that there's a definitive teaching and a provisional teaching. So, for example, in esoteric Buddhism, they would say that the definitive teaching, let's say if it's Shingon, then the definitive teaching is the Vairochana Abhisambodhi Sutra. In Tendai Buddhism, the definitive teaching is the Lotus Sutra. Well, likewise, in Jōdo Shinshū and Jōdo Shu, the definitive teaching is the 3 Pure Land Sutras. But within that, most of the contents are themselves also provisional. The definitive teaching within that is the 18th vow. And so by reciting the 18th vow, or rather, in the wording of the 18th vow, which implies Namo Amida Butsu, we have faith, we have the essence of faith, the object of the understanding of the sentient being, and we have Namo Amida Butsu, that the sentient being and the Buddha are one. And so by reciting Namo Amida Butsu, you also are reciting all of the sutras, all of the Mahayana sutras in one thought moment. and you're realizing all the Dharma, even though you're a limited sentient being and can't, wrap your head around even reading, the Dhammapada. Sometimes there are some things in there which are hard to understand as well. So we don't have to have any kind of wisdom or learning, but we do have to have listening, deep listening, and understanding in order to embrace that. And so how is it that the word how is it that words can be the substance of the Buddha? That's the essence of your question, and essentially that's the answer is compassion. That the Buddha has compassion on sentient beings and knows that they are limited and they need something to hold on to. And this is the central teaching of one of the teachings. Maybe you could say the central teaching of the Lotus Sutra is the lifespan of the Buddha, but the thing leading up to that is skillful means, right? And everything the Buddha teaches is just a skillful means to point to the truth. This, like the Nirvana Sutra says as well, rely on the words. Rely on the Dharma, not on the words. And of course, he also says rely on the definitive teaching, not on the provisional teaching. So the wording that is used throughout all of the sutras is just pointing to that ultimate truth. And so we use the Nembutsu as a raft within this world. The Dharma is still the Buddha's body. All of the Dharma, even the agamas, the Dhammapada, that's also the Buddha's body as well. That's the Dharmakara. It's just that the way that we can jump on that raft, the easiest way to jump on that raft is through the Nembutsu. So yeah, that's kind of a convoluted way of putting it, but I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. And in this case, rely on the Dharma, not on the word, but the Dharma is the word. So it's kind of like uniting. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's why you have to have understanding. And so Anjin Ketsujō Shō says reciting superficially reciting I forgot what the word it was reciting without understanding doesn't have it's not the same. Yeah, you can have the merit-based birth in the Pure Land where you get the relative birth but you still have to make your way to the ultimate liberation within the Pure Land. But if you realize Buddha nature in Shinjin, this is what the Nirvana Sutra is pointing to as well, is you have to have that that glimpse of Buddha nature to realize Buddhahood. And that can happen through the grace of the Buddha, through the light of the Buddha, through the Buddha's light. And so the example I'm rambling now, but the example that the Nirvana Sutra uses is Ajatashatru. He killed his father. Well, he's responsible for his father's death. And he is afraid of falling into hell. And then he encounters the Buddha. And the Buddha shines his light on Ajatashatru. And then he suddenly realizes that by taking refuge in the Buddha, he can attain liberation. He can also avoid he still goes to hell to suffer for a short period. But anyway, there's another text that describes his time in hell as being like a bouncing ball. It bounces into hell and then bounces up. He just touches his toe for a moment to the fires of Avicii hell and then goes back up to a Pure Land.
Is that the one that you translated? Do you want to plug in your Ajatasattu book?
Oh, actually, I don't. It's in the bookshelf, but the agamas say he became a Pratyeka Buddha, but the Ajatasattu Kalkrucha Vinodana says he becomes a Buddha after so many eons, right? And but the thing that light that made him have that turning about is said to give rise to rootless faith without roots. And so if it's faith that we have to cultivate through our experience, which is the way that the agamas and the nikayas frame faith, what is faith? It's something that comes based on experience. It gives you the confidence to practice meditation and so forth. But that's something which comes about through practice over time, trying and seeing, like it says in the agamas, or rather the nikayas in Pali, ehi pasako, come and see. try it for yourself. Well, actually, rootless faith, there's no root, so there's no trying beforehand. It's but you do have to be open to it, right? So Ajatasattu, he was completely and fully aware of his, you could say, his wretchedness as a sentient being because of his evil deeds. Now we have all of those evil deeds in our past lives, but we don't remember it because it's in our past lives. He did that, and then because he had conscience, he was able to recognize that and give rise to what Shandao would call the twofold profound conviction, which is something which the Anjin Ketsujō Shō does mention, which is on the one hand, the recognition that I'm an ordinary sentient being full of blind passions, ever sinking and ever migrating throughout samsara, incapable of attaining any good by my own practice. And even if I do any good, it's poisoned good. It's a little bit of good with a drop of evil. There's a little bit of a selfish motive, like, oh, I want to practice meditation so I can look good for others, so they can say, oh, he's the master, and look, he's shining lights out of his halo. um, you know, and then the other profound conviction of the twofold profound conviction is recognizing the primal vow that Amida Buddha provides us with the means to attain liberation. And so by completely relying on Amida Buddha, one can attain birth in the Pure Land and attain Buddhahood. Now, for Ajatasattu, he does this through his object of refuge is Shakyamuni Buddha. But again, rely on the Dharma, not on the words. So from the Jōdo Shinshū perspective, the ultimate meaning, the ultimate implication is rely on Amida Buddha, rely on the primal vow. So reading things through the lens of the primal vow is kind of how people go about things in Pure Land interpretations, which is how they do things in Tendai, reading things through the lens of the Lotus Sutra.
Yeah. So you had mentioned how the AKS Anjin Ketsujō Shō mentions how when you recite the Nembutsu, so you shouldn't do it in a perfunctory way, in an unmindful way, but with understanding. And does it say, like, without understanding it won't lead to birth in the Pure Land? Or at least it warns about doing it in this way. And but the text also mentions that, or at least the tradition mentions that the Nembutsu should be practiced without any calculation, hakarai. So what is the difference between understanding, which seems to be, at least it has to be conceptual at some level, right? Like there's some kind of mental act, and what's the difference between that and hakarai? How do we cultivate understanding without hakarai?
Understanding, like I mentioned earlier, the object of understanding is the primal vow. But you bring about understanding, or rather, understanding comes about through listening to the Dharma, listening to the primal vow. But the hakarai, or the calculation, specifically refers to calculating, doing X gives me Y. So it's like adding up your merit points, that if I do all of these good deeds, I'll get Buddhahood. And so you still have to, you do have understanding through, you grasp things through a conventionally understanding the words that the teacher is saying, or that the sutra or the text is saying. But it's not the understanding which gives you birth in the Pure Land. It's the openness, the entrusting that the understanding opens up in you. Does that make sense? So this is why the Anjin Ketsujō Shō says that even while we have hakarai, even while we have calculative thinking, we are liberated and we utter the Nembutsu. And there's a section on that in Fascicle 1, Section 7, the realization of Nembutsu Samadhi, which says that which answers this quite nicely. So let's see. So if we try to give rise to faith, if we try to give rise to faith with calculation, because we are of low capacity, that superficial understanding, superficial faith can't be effective. But when one hears and comprehends the reasoning, when one understands the primal vow, then faith inevitably rises through natural working, or jinen. So so that's to say, one has to come to an understanding that accords with the meaning of the Nembutsu, that is Namo Amida Butsu, the unity between the sentient being and the Buddha. And so this means that one listens to the Dharma, but the faith that arises comes about through natural working, on the path towards receiving the Anjin or Shinjan. One will inevitably have, what some people would call falsely settled Shinjin or falsely settled Anjin, and think that one has an understanding, which is not Shinjin, which is grounded rather in calculation, thinking that, oh well, because I've done this or that, I've received the cause of birth, and I've received the cause of awakening. But ultimately it comes about through other power, through natural working, through repeated exposure to the Dharma and listening to the Dharma. That's what opens the curtains more and more. But one doesn't force it open, because it'll break the curtain rail, you could say, and then it won't function. Which I had this problem here. So for example, okay, but there's just this one passage which might be helpful. So it says in section 7, the Nembutsu of those who rely on self-power only serves to displace the Buddha. As ordinary beings, we relegate him to the Western land, scarcely thinking of the Buddha's other power, while rarely reciting the name. Therefore, the Buddha and sentient beings are set apart. But when path-mindedness, that is to say, bodhicitta, which is Buddha nature, arises even slightly, birth may appear to be within reach, but when Nembutsu and path-mindedness start to wane, birth feels extremely uncertain. And as the mind of sentient beings seldom gives rise to path-mindedness, they find themselves largely doubting their birth. Even if one waits until the moment of death to form a determination for birth, any expectation of birth remains weak, just like occasionally appearing before someone important and performing a service. So people might feel like they recite the Nembutsu out of obligation. It's not spontaneous. It's not a spontaneous gratitude. This is because one is wondering how to conform to the Buddhist mind. One's always thinking, well, how do I make that union? How do I join? Not realizing that actually it's already there. Thinking of ways to follow the Buddha so as to receive the grace of birth. But as long as the settled mind of sentient beings and the Buddha's great compassion are remote from each other, they will always remain distant from the Buddha, and under such circumstances, birth is extremely uncertain. The Nembutsu Samadhi means that the great compassionate vow practice of the recompensed Buddha Amida has from the very beginning entered into the thoughts of deluded beings, and unknowingly, this is spontaneously or naturally, without being taught, they're listening, but this is natural working occurring while you're listening. They are brought into the true awakening of Namo Amida Butsu, where the unity of an aspirant and the Dharma is fully realized in the Dharma body. Since all vow practices originate from this body, the hands that worship, the mouth that recites, and the mind that has faith are all the unfolding of other power. And so when that unfolding of other power, that spontaneous natural working is happening, when one's listening to the Dharma, it could take years. One may be engaging in all sorts of practices which are leading up to that point where one has that full entrusting, it feels like you're engaging in self-power practices at the time. But then after you realize Shinjin or Anjin, when you look back in retrospect, you realize, oh, that was actually the working of other power.
Mm,
It was,
mm,
yeah. So, but so long, every time you're engaging in an action, thinking that it's, it's going to bring about your birth, whenever you're calculating, setting yourself apart from the Buddha. And so essentially the idea is that you listen to the Dharma and you just increase your receptivity through listening to the Dharma, but you don't actually do anything. You don't actively do anything. It sounds strange, but you don't actively do anything while listening, in that process of listening. But things, you spontaneously go ahead and you recite the Nembutsu, you put your palms together. Um, and then but you only realize in retrospect that that was the vow power, that was the working of other power. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so it seems like it's definitely like a self-power versus other power distinction, and another way of talking about it, I guess more from a like a phenomenological perspective, like how it feels like self-power feels like you're calculating or you're trying to add up points, like, okay, if I do this, then I'll get closer to enlightenment, or I'm more likely to attain birth in the Pure Land if I like recite this many Nembutsus like every day, and I'm gonna, whereas like the other one, um, the understanding is more just like having faith in the vow and in the Buddha, and just gradually coming to accept that's the case, that your birth is settled.
Right.
Um,
And both Honen and Shinran point out that the when you recite with calculation, or literally calculating or adding up the numbers of recitation, whether you think just one recitation is sufficient or many recitations is sufficient, we're actually presuming upon the vow and assuming that that there's something that we have to do in order to accomplish the vow, but the vow is already accomplished. So that's why the recitation is just spontaneous. You don't give any thought to the number. One is enough. Many is enough. Both are the fulfillment of the vow.
yeah. I guess the next question that comes to mind is, if it is the case, like we attain enlightenment through the Buddha's other power and so on, then why is there this emphasis on reciting Nembutsu correctly, or having this correct attitude? Um, because I mean, if Nembutsu is like an expression of something that's already happened in a timeless moment, and the Buddha's power will receive everyone. Why does it matter? Like if I have hakarai or if I have understanding or not? Like why? I guess this is kind of like the Ippen question, right? Like this figure in Japan who was like said, just recite the Nembutsu. It doesn't matter like if you have faith or not. Like I guess the question is, I guess it goes back to that. Like if the Buddha's power is will save everyone, and if it's already accomplished, then why do we have to say it correctly and without hakarai? Um,
Well, it's actually that uh, we don't need to recite the number two correctly. That's the thing.
yeah,
You have to come to the point where you give up thinking, oh, I have to do it in this perfect way. Like, there's some people who practice the Dharma where they can't sit they can't set out to do any practice until the room is perfectly clean. They wash their mouth and their hands, and wipe the powdered incense on their hands, and then set the light, set the candles, put the incense in, and then ring the bells and set out all of your offerings every day, every morning, and then set out to do your 1 hour recitation without any mistake. But if for the ordinary person, if that's the bar you have to meet, they're never going to recite the Nembutsu once. um, so the correct, I mean, if that's not, people think, okay, well, yeah, that some people say that's the correct way of reciting, but then other people might look at the Anjin Ketsujō Shō or Jōdo Shū and Jōdo Shinshū and think it's suggesting that the correct way of reciting the Nembutsu is to do so with thinking in my mind, I am one with the Buddha, I am one with the Buddha, I am one. Well, this is also calculative thinking. So essentially the point is to give up thinking that I have to do anything. Just the idea, the practice just becomes listening to the Dharma, listening to the primal vow. And again, listening to the primal vow doesn't mean listening to the wording of the 18th vow over and over again. It means listening to, it could be listening to any Dharma, it could be listening to reading any sutra, but then keeping in mind the primal vow and how it relates to the sutra, and how the primal vow, as it relates to the sutra, relates to you as a sentient being. And that's kind of how that connection builds. Well, you couldn't say it's not how the connection builds, but it's how the barriers start to break away, but the barriers blocking you from entrusting the doubt. When you listen to the Dharma spontaneously by the working of other power, one comes to have faith. And this sounds very counterintuitive, but if you think about something soft like water, if water is dripping on a rock for 50 years, okay, many years. I don't know how many years it would take, but eventually it will bore a hole through the rock because just because of the pressure, the friction over time. And so it's likewise with listening to the Dharma. You could say it's soft. You're not actually engaging in any practice, but it whittles away at the doubt, and gradually one comes to entrust. And it's that is the working of other power. And so one doesn't have to think about how you recite the Nembutsu. Once one has entrusting, one recites the Nembutsu spontaneously. That's to say, one recognizes that one is saved just as one is, and then wishes to repay the Buddha in gratitude. And the Nembutsu is an expression of that, but it can be expressed in, that's to say, Namo Amida Butsu is an expression of that, but it can be expressed in various ways. Various ways in which we express gratitude to the Buddha. So just thinking of the Buddha and feeling thankful, that can also be Namo Amida Butsu. So it's recollection of Namo, sentient being, and Amida Butsu being united, and that coming to full consummation after rebirth in the Pure Land.
Thanks. So is this part of what's then called the Nembutsu Samadhi in the text? Classically, Samadhi is sort of like a state of mind where you're sort of deeply absorbed in whatever. And so how is like Nembutsu Samadhi understood here? Because it seems like a different understanding of the term Samadhi, at least.
Well, you could say that the Nembutsu Samadhi in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, and also I'm not sure how people talk about it in contemporary Jōdo Shu, but at least in Jōdo Shinshū, we would understand it more or less as the Anjin Ketsujō Shō explains it, and that's what I guess I would describe it as being a Copernican shift in samadhi. So the Copernican shift refers to the shift from thinking of the Earth as the center of the cosmos to the sun being the center of the solar system. And so likewise, when we usually think of samadhi, is a meditative state where the mind is united with an object of meditation that the sentient being does, that the practitioner does. So if you're doing Nembutsu Samadhi in the conventional way, you visualize the Buddha, you think of the Buddha, and you keep your mind on the Buddha or on a visualization of the Pure Land, or you visualize Buddhas in all directions, like in the Pratyutpana Samadhi, or you bring that about through various practices. However, the Nembutsu Samadhi in the Anjin Ketsujō Shō it's the Samadhi of the Buddha. So it's the Samadhi of the Buddha which holds the sentient being in mind. And so essentially the Nembutsu Samadhi is when uh, is when one realizes the inseparability of oneself from the Buddha. So it's the recognition of Namo Amida Butsu. It is Anjin itself. It's Shinjin itself, and so it's a non-med. On our side, it's a non-meditative samadhi. So it's not actually something you sit down and practice on a cushion. And so reciting the Nembutsu in faith in Anjin is for the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, the practice of the Nembutsu samadhi. So it's something that is to say, it's something that the Buddha practices. You could say kind of indirectly through sentient beings. It's something that the Buddha is doing in us. It's something which we already had. We already had the Nembutsu samadhi before we gave rise to faith. And so, yeah. Does that?
Yeah. Well, and that's not that weird either to think that samadhi is something that's already there. I mean, famously in the Abhidharma Kosha, like Vasubandhu says, like he says that samadhi is one of the dharmas that are constantly present in the mind. I believe so. It's not that weird to say that, like even from a classic like Abhidharma perspective. Obviously, this is like a different thing in the AKS, but. And then there was a part of the Anjin Ketsujō Shō that discusses the Nembutsu Samadhi as exclusive and again exclusive. And this seems to be related to this idea that we need to abandon all miscellaneous practices and just sort of have this like focus, this exclusive focus on the Nembutsu. And I mean, I personally, and I've seen other people also, this is like one of the sticking points when it comes to like Japanese Pure Land and like, Shinshū or Jōdo Shu. It's like, this is always something that is sort of difficult for a lot of people because it's like, oh yeah, I love the theology and stuff and like the, Buddhology, if you will, and like the idea of other power and stuff. But it's like, why can't I do all these other practices too? Like, like it seems like, oh, now I have to limit myself like to this one practice only. And I guess in the Chinese tradition, this isn't as much of a thing when you practice Pure Land. So this seems to be like a more of a Japanese tradition thing. So how do we understand this like exclusivity of Nembutsu Samadhi and of Pure Land Buddhism in general in Japan? And yeah, I don't know. What would you say to people that are sort of having a hard time with this specific doctrine of like, oh, now you have to abandon these practices and just focus on one thing?
Yeah, well, that's normal because sentient beings, we actually can't abandon from our side the wish or the desire to do things, to accomplish things, because we think, the way that the human mind thinks or the sentient being's mind thinks is calculative. 1 + 1 = 2. You do the work, you get the result. So the key is and this is actually kind of something that the Anjin Ketsujō Shō makes quite clear, I think, for practitioners of traditions where there is an idea where you practice exclusively, and that's that it says in that section 18 that when one returns to the Nembutsu Samadhi, is to say when one realizes Anjin, then it is said to be exclusive and again exclusive. So the two exclusivities of practice and mind, where one doesn't one doesn't engage in what we would call sundry practices or practices where we believe the merit to accumulate and to give rise to the result. And also the exclusivity of mind where we think only on the primal vow as the object of the of our faith is something which comes about only after Anjin. So people who are concerned about abandoning various practices, they don't really have to, you shouldn't be concerned about that. Just listen to the Dharma, and the natural working will bring one to that spontaneously. People are inclined to do things because of their karma, because of their habitual inclinations. So you can't just give up that way of thinking overnight. And so this is something which Shinran calls sangan tenyu, or turning and entering by the three vows. So people usually, and this was my experience as well in practicing the Dharma and coming to Pure Land Buddhism, is people, first of all, you're practicing general Buddhism, but then when you decide, well, I may not be able to achieve the goal that I want in this life, so I'm going to dedicate the merit of all my practices to birth in the Pure Land. So that's when people first enter the gate of the 19th vow. And then when people start to build up their faith and they start to see, well, why am I engaging in all of these other practices? I should recite the Nembutsu, do visualizations, worship Amida, make offerings to Amida statue, and so forth, and dedicate the merit to pure birth in the Pure Land. That's when one turns and enters the gate of the 20th vow. One cannot then, by one's own effort, abandon that way of thinking and just enter the 18th vow by oneself. It's not possible to do so by your own power. It has to happen through other power. It has to happen spontaneously. And so this is what something Shinran writes in his Jōdo Wasan, the Japanese poems on the Pure Land, that people who practice through the gate of the 20th vow spontaneously and without being taught enter into the vow of the gate of the universal vow of the 18th vow. So it's spontaneous and without being taught. So it happens through natural working, other power, through the influence. And so when one's practicing, when one may even be practicing, let's say one's going to a Jōdo Shu temple or Jōdo Shinshū temple, one is practicing the Nembutsu and doing all of these recitations, and maybe one thinks that one has Shinjin, or one has abandoned other practices, but one may still have some doubts in the back of one's mind. Just by continuing to listen to the Dharma and reflect on how it relates to one as a sentient being, that allows the working of other power to bring one towards the 18th vow. And it's all of the Dharma is like a magnet bringing one to the 18th vow, at least from the perspective of Pure Land Buddhism. So no matter what kind of Dharma you're practicing, it's all leading to that ultimate end. But the closer you get, the stronger the magnet gets. So you get to the 19th vow, it pulls you to the 20th vow spontaneously. You get to the 20th vow, and it pulls you even stronger to the 18th vow. And so it happens spontaneously by its own working. So it's something that people don't have to worry about, how about being good or being bad or or doing this or that. It's just something that you just have to take it easy, and listen to the Dharma and see, when you listen to the Dharma, oh, this is just so easy. It's just so simple. You just have to entrust and say the name. And when you get to the point where you can just entrust and let go, then one enters the 18th vow. But it happens, one comes to that point spontaneously. It doesn't happen the first day that one becomes a Buddhist. It takes time in listening to the Dharma.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense. I guess it's sometimes we have this way of approaching the Dharma. It's like we encounter a tradition, and okay, now I'm gonna do everything and like try to make myself, like, my current practice align itself perfectly to like whatever this tradition says. And whereas you seem to be saying it's something that happens like naturally. You don't have to try to get yourself to be a certain way. I guess that would be more hakarai.
Yeah. And people like to construct, this is what we do as sentient beings, we like to construct an identity. So I'm a Shin Buddhist, I have to get all of the right ninju, the beads, and and all of the paraphernalia and stuff. But so sometimes that can be a hindrance when we think about when we continue thinking about identity. That, oh, this is something that which will make me achieve the goal. It's all calculation.
Yeah, yeah. So the next topic I wanted to talk about was so I guess the general idea of like attainment, attaining Buddhahood and other like benefits from the practice, if you will. So generally speaking, in Shin Buddhism and I guess the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, um, the idea is we don't attain Buddhahood in this life, right? Which is this is like a classic teaching in like maybe Tendai and Shingon and stuff, but like in the Pure Land school, we can't attain Buddhahood in this life, only in the after death in the Pure Land when we're being born in the Pure Land. But then there's this doctrine of like the non-duality between us and the Buddha. And also this idea that I think was in the quote that you read previously of the unity of the three actions, which it's like the practitioner or the sentient beings, body, speech, and mind somehow converge or are united with those of the Buddha. Um, and that sort of seems to point to like, well, if that's the case, if that happens, then like, why can't we attain Buddhahood in this life? Like why would that be denied if we have this idea that there's this possible convergence between the three the three actions. Um, and so can you sort of explain like why that's not accepted in Pure Land, Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, like why we can't attain Buddhahood in this life? And how then we understand this convergence of the three actions and yeah.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, with regard to attaining Buddhahood in this life, um, the the main issue is that we're in a samsaric body. We're trapped in a karmically conditioned body with the violence, and this is a bit like I guess you could compare it a bit to in Sravakayana or Theravada. There's this idea of nirvana with remainder. Is of course someone who attains arhatship and nirvana with remainder has, they're on a very different, very high level, but they can still receive the fruits of their karma until they die. But then after they die, the karma is completely exhausted. And so it's similar to that. One makes the connection which allows one to attain birth in this life, uh, but one still has a karmic body, and so one still has to attain birth in the Pure Land in order to fully consummate awakening. And so embodiment is kind of the main issue, a bit like in Neoplatonism as well. Being embodied and being in material form is an issue. The Buddha is everywhere, right? And yeah, it's kind of hard to do that. And another thing is, I guess, I mean, something that I would say is this is also kind of the case in all Buddhism, except we have a few exceptions, right? So the idea of a Buddha and a bodhisattva, they always have their last life. The Buddha descends from Tushita heaven and is born and he goes through the 12 stages of life with the 32 marks and 18 minor marks. He has the 10 powers. He even as he's descending from Tushita heaven and he's born in his mother's womb, he can recall his past lives. And this is something which, it's too late for us. Even if we attain it now, we passed that point. So if you want to attain Buddhahood, you have to do so in a Pure Land. You have to do so before one, at least from the Mahayana perspective. You have to do so beforehand. And even from a Theravada perspective, you have to have all the requisites before you're born, as in your final life as a bodhisattva. So you have all of these powers, lots of powers, not all of them, but you have a lot of them before your final life. And so for most of us, it's too late. And then another thing that you can do is look at the description of the the stages, the 10 stages, the 10 bhumis. Even the first bhumi is beyond, this is something Shandao points out, even the 10th bhumi is beyond the achievements of most people, even the people who we consider to be the greatest teachers on earth. We can't read their minds, so we don't know, but it can be, you can question whether they've really achieved that, where in every single moment they're seeing thousands of Buddhas in all directions and getting messages from the Buddhas immediately, and being able to have all of these supernormal powers. And so this idea that there's a universal model or paradigm for bodhisattva activity is something which we see in section 2 of the larger sutra, the Sukhavati Vyuha, where it describes all bodhisattvas go through these life stages. They teach the Dharma, they manifest entering into nirvana. Now, in regard to the three actions, the convergence of the practitioner's body, speech, and mind with those of Amida Buddha, and the idea here is that these become the body, speech, and mind of Amida Buddha become enabling actions or enabling vehicles for our body, speech, and mind. So they can have a gradual positive influence on us throughout our lives. And so Shinran talks about this a little bit, that we gradually come to prefer engaging in good deeds because we are thinking of the Buddha more often than we would if we didn't have Shinjin. But it's not as if we are fully awakened as a result, but we get that positive influence in our body, speech, and mind. There's a well-known heterodoxy in Shin which turns it around, which says you have to engage in good deeds with body, speech, and mind to to show that you have Shinjin, but it's not necessary. It just depends on the person and how deep their connection is.
So there are certain positive benefits that come from the practice, even if you're not going to be attaining Buddhahood in this life.
Yeah, exactly. So this is something which actually the Anjin Ketsujō Shō doesn't get into, but in Jōdo Shinshū it's talked about. And there's a series that I published on Substack. I have a Substack called Shaku Shingan. And there I published a series on Shinran's hymns on present benefits, where he goes through all of the present benefits. Most of them are protection by unseen beings. But Shinran also says, for example, in one of his letters, that this is quite a well-known passage, that previously, you were drunk with the wine of ignorance and had a liking only for the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. But since you've begun to hear the Buddha's vow, you have gradually awakened from the drunkenness of ignorance, gradually rejected the three poisons, and come to prefer at all times the medicine of Amida Buddha. So people who have long heard the Buddha's name, who receive Shinjin and say the Nembutsu, gradually come to show signs of rejecting evil and show signs of wishing to cast off evil in themselves. They don't do so calculatively, but they come to just prefer that way of living. So you'll actually find it can be sometimes surprising, because in Jōdo Shinshū there's no obligation to become vegetarian or what have you, but you do find a lot of Shin Buddhists become vegetarian, or they don't officially take the 5 precepts or 10 precepts, but they you'll be hard pressed to find really mean people in a Shin temple, in my experience. So the idea is that we just come naturally to be aware of our evil, and that's part of the twofold profound conviction that I mentioned earlier, that Shandao describes as faith. So we become aware of our evil. Sometimes it can be kind of, it might sound kind of negative, but we can't really, we find it hard to think of ourselves as good. But that also means that we come to be aware of our afflictions, and we understand that the Buddha doesn't judge whether we're good or bad. So it's something that happens naturally, and so there are signs of like renunciation, which can happen, but it's not a necessary part of Anjin or Shinjin.
Yeah, and that recognition of our own like badness or defilement. I know that the Anjin Ketsujō Shō also talks about how we should have like conscience and shame. Like it cites this passage from Shandao, praises of the Pratipana Samadhi, um, which says one should have conscience and shame. Shakyamuni Tathagata is truly a compassionate father and mother, and how we should have like this feelings of shame for not accepting the Dharma for countless lifetimes. So in that case, then is that like a complementary to faith, or is that like a part of faith, like how in Shanda there's the twofold, like what you just mentioned, the twofold faith, and like part of that is recognizing our own bamboo nature, our own nature as like just defiled and sort of kind of hopeless being. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, it's very much a kind of a um, side effect. So another thing that comes from Shinjin and Anjin is joy. So it's not that you have to give rise to joy and then you'll get Shinjin or Anjin. It's that it's kind of like the bubbling to the surface. I used this analogy earlier of there's groundwater, right? But there are springs, and it bubbles to the surface. But within that faith, there's also the recognition that we as on the relative level, we have an absolute separation from Buddha, and that's our problem, right? Because we think of the Buddha as absolutely separate. On the ultimate level, we have an absolute unity, and that's what Namo Amida Butsu is, although we say it in the relative world, in this world. So we have that realization, but we also have that absolute depravity, you could say. I'm sorry to use a Christian term, but uh, you know, that is what gives rise to the conscience and shame. It's like, well, it's just too bad it took this long, and now we're here. And we have remorse. So shame and remorse, conscience and shame. So he says, or that author says that, so the two characters, Zan and Gi, denote the feeling of remorse, Haji, before heaven and people. Sounds like kind of Confucian way of putting things, and also feeling shame before oneself and others. So in Confucianism, there's this idea that the good man, or the kunshi, the righteous person. How do you know they're righteous? Well, they not only do good in front of others, but they don't do bad when others are not looking. So because they have conscience. Yeah. So it might be a kind of a Confucian influence there, but I think that's also connected to Shandao.
Yeah, well, and the agamas also like talk about like Hri and Altapa, I think, right? Like it's like one of those is shame, and the other one I forget how to translate it, but it's similar concepts of like shame, and the Buddha calls them like the protectors of the world, because people who have those feelings, that's it sort of protects them from doing good, like from doing bad, from doing bad things.
Oh yeah,
Um,
people, because guilt is something which has been very I mean, people who come to Buddhism from let's say a lot of people come to Buddhism from Christianity, and they might have a bad feeling towards the idea of guilt because it's something that if they went to Sunday school, it was taught to them from from childhood. So, and that's something which might be kind of, they might have bad memories of that. But actually, why is it that we don't do bad? Why is it that we don't do evil deeds even in private? Well, because we have conscience. We have shame. We would be ashamed if people found out that we did something wrong. So that's why. And so it's definitely a virtue. But yeah, of course there is uh, you know un unrealistic guilt, and guilt about things which don't exist. So I think from the Buddhist perspective, we would say if you have guilt about original sin, it's guilt about something which you don't. It's not something that you actually did, so it's an uh, unrealistic thing to have guilt over. Uh, so um, so yeah, it has to be something. It's kind of more of a proactive sense that I'm not going to do bad deeds because I have conscience and shame about what would happen if I were to do that.
Yeah. So I have one more question for you. I know I've kept you here for a long time, and thank you for being so gracious with your time. Um, so th this last question, I just want you to sort of tie the Anjin Ketsujō Shō's teachings with with the teachings of Shinran, because I mean, this text is obviously really important in Jōdo Shinshū, and it's really important for Rennyo and so on. And uh, so how do you see like the main similarities and differences? I guess there's a lot of similarities, but like uh, if you were to compare and contrast a little bit between this text and Shinran, um, how would you how would you talk about that?
Well, I think the in terms of the type of text, the determination of the settled mind, the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, is something which it's intended probably for a priestly audience. It's probably closer to something like Shinran's Kyōgyō Shinsho, although Kyōgyō Shinsho is very long. And this is just a few, it's just a few pages long, really. So it's not for a popular audience. And Shinran was, maybe you could say this is a difference, is Shinran was definitely trying to popularize Honen, how he understood Honen's teachings for regular people. And so he wrote poems in Japanese. Actually, Anjin Ketsujō Shō is written in Japanese, but Shinran wrote in easy to understand Japanese verses, which they still make sense in modern Japanese to an extent. And that's something that Rennyo also took up. And then another difference is to a large extent, we can definitely kind of draw it out as an implication, but we don't see Shinran explicitly using Hongaku thought or original enlightenment thought, whereas the Anjin Ketsujō Shō seems to use it a bit more without explicitly using the word. However, I would say that the Anjin Ketsujō Shō is going a bit further than most Shin Buddhists would go, and further than Shinran would go in talking about the unity of sentient being and the Buddha, because I think actually that the dualistic perspective of the Buddha as being something out there that we have to take refuge in is actually something which is emphasized by Shinran and by Rennyo, and especially Rennyo. It's something that they kind of emphasize definitely as a skillful means. Of course, we see also in Shinran, he talks about, the Dharma body of suchness being it's the ocean, which encompasses, it's the ocean that encompasses all beings. That all beings have this, this mind of Shinjin, which is like the sun obscured by clouds and mist. And even though there may be clouds and mist, beyond it is bright and not dark. And so we just have to remove it. But even and see the sun, and we'll see the sun shining through. But even when there are clouds there, even when we have defilements, we can still be embraced, right, just as we are. And so that's kind of Shinran's approach. So admitting or kind of emphasizing that while we are still defiled, we have assurance of our birth. And then so that's kind of how I see Shinran going. With something like the most popular text of Shinran these days is the Tanisho, which is about it's kind of like looking at misunderstandings of Honen's teachings and how Shinran responded to those. Although Shinran didn't write the Tanisho, it was by his student. Now, in terms of and so the Anjin Ketsujō Shō doesn't really talk about any deviations really. It just kind of exhorts the reader to take refuge and to have faith but have faith with the understanding of Kiho-itai, the unity of sentient being and the Dharma. And then in terms of commonalities, of course, they see, probably due to Honen's influence, the primal vow, as the 18th vow, and that the 18th vow is the definitive teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. So Honen is the one who came up with this idea that the reason why Shakyamuni Buddha came into the world was to teach the primal vow, was to teach the Nembutsu, and everything else is provisional. And so you have to he would say, you have to haidetsu, you have to reject the sundry practices and adopt the definitive practice, and do senju Nembutsu, exclusive Nembutsu. But both Shinran and the Anjin Ketsujō Shō have this in common, that they recognize the way by which you get there is the working of other power, spontaneous working of other power. You get to that point, you get to the entrusting in the primal vow without being taught. So you do listen to the Dharma, but you don't actually, there's no technique. There's no technique for having Shinjin. It's just something that happens through natural working while you're listening to the Dharma. And so that's really something that Shinran has in common with the Anjin Ketsujō Shō, but something which Rennyo which influenced Rennyo a lot. And another thing that they both emphasize is the spiritual equality of all beings. And I'd say that's probably the most important aspect of the universal liberation of all beings that both Shinran and Anjin Ketsujō Shō have in common, including people who were excluded by the mainstream of Buddhist practice in society at the time. So people who hunted and fished, people who could not engage in shugyo or austerities, women especially. It specifically mentions women as people who are embraced by the primal vow. And so these are things that Shinran and the Anjin Ketsujō Shō have in common. And I think that's because if indeed Shōkū is the author, he was interpreting the teachings of Honen in much the same way that Shinran was, and they came to very similar interpretations. And we have other students of Honen who came to some different interpretations, but the reason that we have these two students of Honen who came to the same interpretation, I think, is significant and worth at least from a Shin perspective, worth coming back to the Anjin Ketsujō Shō. And people in Seizan and Jōdo Shinshū, I'm sure they would say the same thing.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your time and for being here, and for all your efforts in translating all of these Mahayana texts. People who don't know you very much, like, you've translated like a lot of different texts, not just this one. So I do want to I'm gonna share some links to your websites and stuff like that so people can check it out on the YouTube video. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to leave with, other than say the
Namo
Nembutsu.
Amida
Say the Nembutsu and be saved by Amida Buddha.
Say the Nembutsu. But if anyone's interested, I have the website shakushingan.com. I'm sure you could put the link maybe in your description. And this book is also available. The PDF is freely available, so if you're interested, please feel free to read it. And I have a Substack that I mentioned as well, and they're just kind of short essays, trying to do it relatively regularly. And my plan is to turn some of those essays into short books as well, and ideally, some introductory material as well as some more difficult material as well, for people who are more familiar with the Pure Land teachings. But yeah, that's more or less all I have to plug. But thank you very much, Javier, for the opportunity to share this teaching.
Absolutely.
This text. Yeah.
And until next time, Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.